Wet palettes change the way we paint with acrylics, making things much easier with us not having to worry about our paint drying up. But they can be quite pricey and come with hidden costs like replacing the membranes as well as the palette paper. So is it worth paying for one, or is the one you make just as good? It turns out that they both have unique properties that are specific to them, but there's one additional benefit for the homemade one that you'll essentially want to make one regardless. The first difference you'll notice is because the homemade palette is made from parchment paint used for baking, as a result, it has a bit of a hydrophobic effect. That means the paint clumps up together, making it seem like there's a lot more water than there actually is. While the one you pay for usually has paper that is specifically designed for it. As a result, the paint spreads a lot more evenly and looks as if you're painting on regular paper. Next up, we need to talk about maintenance. With a homemade palette, you always have to worry about mold growing on your palette, and as a result, you have to constantly wash it, replace it, and make sure your container stays clean. While the ones you buy usually have a special coating on them that's designed to prevent funguses and mold growing on them. I've had my wet palette for close to 4 years now, and I never had to worry about mold or any of the stink coming out from there that is quite famous for some wet palettes. With a homemade palette, I previously tried using it for up to a week, and it began developing this very unpleasant smell that was irradiating from the entire palette as well as the paint that I was using on it. It became quite pungent, and it's not something you want to experience. So the maintenance for your homemade palette is you constantly need to make sure that you're replacing the container and giving it a good wash, a proper scrubbing. That's why I prefer using paper towels, because I can just throw them out. A sponge, it will eventually develop some mold. While the routine for the one you pay for is to simply add in a bit of water, place in a fresh sheet, and you're good to go. There are, however, two very important benefits of using a homemade palette, and that's the fact that you can make it as big as you want. Literally put some piece of parchment on here, and this is now a wet palette. You can paint several armies all in the same one. If you have several people painting at the same time, you could also use just the same one. Alternatively, if you have limited space or you're traveling, you can even make a mini palette for your miniatures. And the next benefit is frankly the main reason I began using homemade palettes again, is the fact that you can use them with metallic paints as well as contrast paints. I really hate having to mix my contrast paints on a dry surface because they dry up and then the entire point of a contrast paint disappears in front of your eyes because they start clumping up. With a wet palette that you can use for contrast paints, it's a perfect solution. Now, I have used some contrast paints on my paint palette in the past, but the problem is they soak into the membrane. As a result, the membrane hardens up and it can't absorb the water as well, so you have these spots around the palette that cannot hold water as well as the others. I always thought that the paid for palette had a much better consistency with keeping your paints wet, that it would do a much better job, it will last longer. But after painting this miniature for 30 minutes, I made sure to take several breaks throughout the entire process, have a drink, have some coffee, go for a walk, and come back and continue painting the miniature. However, no matter how many times I would come back after my breaks, the paint consistency was indistinguishable to me. After several hours of doing it, I ended up switching entirely to the homemade palette and finished painting my Poxwalker. On top of that, I left both these palettes on my table. I didn't cover them in any way. I went to sleep. Next day, I simply rehydrated both wet palettes by adding a tiny amount of water, and using a wet brush, I went over the paints to see if they were still usable. The paints from both palettes were usable, and there was no noticeable difference between the two of them. So at the end of it, is it worth paying for one? It depends. Is the convenience of not having to worry about mold, is the convenience of having to simply just put on a piece of paper worth it for you? Get one. They're fantastic. But you do have to consider the fact that you will be paying every single time you need more paper, every single time you need to replace a sponge, and eventually the coating for the antifungal property will wear down, so you have to replace it. And if you want a bigger one, you gotta buy a bigger one, and those get very expensive. So ultimately, the decision's up to you. Personally, I'm now using both of them, and for the factors that I mentioned, I simply like the convenience of this one, but I use contrast paints and metallics a lot, so I started making this one as well. Just remember, if you use a homemade palette, whatever you do not reuse it for too long. Make sure you wash it. You will get mold onto it, and eventually your miniatures will start stinking as much as this thing. Not to mention that some molds can be very harmful. You never know what you can grow. So thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful to some of you. I'll see you next time. Then we grab a small piece of parchment paper.